The mediation room was colder than I expected. Not just the temperature, though the AC hummed loud and clinical, but the silence between us. Across the table, my husband of 17 years didn't look at me. But his lawyer did. He was young, smug, the kind of man who'd worn expensive shoes long before earning them. He flipped open his folder, looked down, then said it. She's not entitled to much. There's no income trail. I didn't blink. But inside, something cracked. No income trail. Like I hadn't paid the bills, logged the receipts, submitted the taxes, cleaned up the payroll mess when his project manager vanished. Like I hadn't been the one chasing contractors, handling clients, writing apology emails for his overpromises. I glanced at the man I once built a life with. He was staring at his water glass like it held the answers. And just beyond him, in the glass reflection of the office wall, I saw myself. Neat blazer, hair pinned back, hands steady. Like a secretary, not a wife, not a partner, just excess. "Excuse me," I said, my voice calm, but my heart was pounding like it wanted out. The lawyer smirked again. No W-2. No salary. No ownership on record. Technically, Mrs. Monroe didn't contribute financially to the marital estate. I wanted to laugh. Or scream. But instead, I reached down and opened my bag. Inside, a leather binder, tab divided, color-coded. Heavy. I laid it gently on the table. "Is that?" my lawyer began. I nodded. 17 years of receipts, I said. And one return. The room quieted, but all I could hear was Eleanor's voice from last Thanksgiving. "You're lucky, Rachel. David provides everything. Just enjoy it." Like I was a pet. A guest. Not the woman who built the spreadsheets while rocking a feverish toddler at midnight. Not the woman who skipped dental appointments to cover another tax bill. The binder clicked open. 17 years. And they thought I didn't keep proof. Let them. Because today wasn't just another legal meeting. It was the day I stopped apologizing for knowing my worth. It was the day I pushed back. And when I handed them that final folder, the one with my name on property titles he didn't even know existed, that was the moment the smirk died. Would you fight back or walk away? Have you ever been erased from your own story? Where are you listening from? The first time I realized something had shifted, it wasn't a grand betrayal. It was quiet. Ordinary. A Tuesday. David had always been careless with receipts. He'd toss them into the kitchen drawer, crumpled with gum wrappers and ballpoint pens that never worked. But that morning, when I reached in to find the plumber's invoice, the drawer was empty. Not cleaned, emptied. I stared at it for a long second, then closed it, slowly, like maybe the receipts would reappear if I didn't look too hard. We'd lived in this house for 11 years, a brown brick colonial with a creaky porch swing and a kitchen that always smelled faintly of cinnamon from some long ago spill in the oven. I loved it here. Even when David said we needed to renovate or resell, I clung to this space like it still meant something. Back then, I still made coffee for us, both each morning. Still packed his lunch on Mondays, even if he always left it in the fridge. Still believed the quietness between us was just a season. "You're always home," he said once, not unkindly. Just absent-mindedly, like I was part of the wallpaper. Like presence without a paycheck wasn't real. But I was never just home. I managed his invoices. I dealt with the property managers, the HOA, the licensing renewals. I knew which contractors always flaked, which ones underbilled, and which ones to keep away from county inspections. At night, I updated our spreadsheets after he fell asleep, watching late night political commentary. I filed quarterly taxes. I emailed our accountant. But none of that showed up on a W-2. None of that counted. When our daughter Ava left for college in 2021, the house fell even quieter. The kitchen table had only 2 chairs occupied now. I set placemats like I always did. His on the left, mine on the right. But he stopped sitting. He worked late more often. He claimed he was networking, grabbing drinks with a few guys from Rotary. The few times I called past 8 p.m., it went to voicemail. I remember asking him one Friday, "Can you at least text me when you're safe?" He looked at me, blinking, confused. "A's in. From crime." He joked. "No," I said quietly. "From me wondering if you're still choosing us." He didn't respond. There was this white ceramic mug we both used. It had a chip on the side. Ava made it in 7th grade, and we never had the heart to throw it out. He used to pour his morning coffee in it every day. One morning, I found it in the back of the cabinet. Dusty. Forgotten. And next to the sink, a new sleek mug, black, matte, no story, no chip, just clean. Around that time, our joint bank account password stopped working. At first, I blamed the system. Too many failed logins, maybe a glitch. So I texted David. "Hey, I can't access the account. Did you update the password?" He replied 10 minutes later. "Yeah, just tightening security a bit. I'll send it later." He didn't. That week, I pulled out the manila folder I'd labeled, "Just in case." It wasn't dramatic. Just receipts, tax filings, contractor logs, PDF printouts from emails he always asked me to just handle. I didn't know then what I was preparing for. I just felt something in my chest, like a leak in the roof you can't see yet, but you smell it coming. That was when I started making copies. Quietly. Neatly. By the time I found the business credit card statements, charges at restaurants we'd never been to, with tips written in a handwriting that wasn't his, I didn't even flinch. I just took a photo, labeled the file, added it to the binder. We had dinner with his parents that month. His mother, Gloria, always called me Sweet Rachel, like I was a child who colored within the lines. "That blue top looks lovely on you," she said, cutting into her chicken. "David, doesn't she look nice?" David nodded, chewing. I smiled. No one noticed I hadn't eaten much. No one asked why I wore long sleeves in September, why I felt colder than the room should allow. At the end of the meal, as I cleared the plates, Gloria touched my shoulder. "You're lucky, you know," she said, quietly, "to have a man like David. Some of us weren't that fortunate." I stood there, dish in hand, wondering what she'd say if I told her her son hadn't kissed me in 3 months. If I told her that, his business relied entirely on unpaid hours I logged while my own resume went stale. But I said nothing, because I still hadn't decided, was I staying, or was I building my exit? The night I found the formal letter from Halber and Rowe LLP in the mailbox, addressed only to Mrs. Rachel Monroe, I sat on the porch and stared at it for 20 minutes. No return address. No note. Just that logo. That weight. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I walked inside, poured myself a glass of wine, and finally opened the folder labeled, "Just in case." Because I knew, the receipts didn't just document numbers, they documented silence, effort, sacrifice, memory. They documented me. The silence between us wasn't new. But now it had sharp edges. He still came home. He still dropped his keys in the same ceramic bowl by the door. But he didn't ask how my day was. He didn't glance at the dinner I cooked. Sometimes, he didn't even take off his shoes. We moved around each other like polite strangers. I knew how he took his coffee. He no longer remembered I'd stopped drinking mine. One afternoon, I noticed a charge on the Amex, a hotel downtown. 2 nights, midweek. We had no event, no renovation crew, no conference. I screenshotted it, filed it in a folder named Discrepancies. I didn't confront him. Not yet. My friend Lina called that week. She was the one who'd introduced us years ago. Back then, I thought she was a little too cynical. Now, she just sounded seasoned. He's distracted. I told her over the phone, watching the wind move the curtains in our living room. There was a pause. Rachel, she said carefully. Is he hiding money? That wasn't what I expected. Not, is he cheating? Or, is something going on? Just straight to the truth women in their 40s learn to ask first. I don't know, I said, but I did. I began checking the mail before he did. I stopped tossing envelopes without opening them. Most days, nothing, until one afternoon, a thick manila envelope arrived. Inside were insurance forms, property title updates, and 2 notarized signatures. His and his accountant's. My name was missing from the second page. I sat on the kitchen floor, back against the fridge, reading that document again and again. My hands didn't shake, they were ice. The title transfer had already gone through. That night, I placed the old mug back in the cabinet. Next to it, I added something new, a voice recorder. Lena once said, "They don't expect us to be quiet and smart. They expect us to either cry or scream, not collect." So I started collecting. At a dinner with his colleagues, I noticed a woman I didn't recognize. Late 20s, polished, over, laughing at his jokes. She brushed something off his shoulder and called him David in a way that made my stomach knot. I sat beside him, smiling. I poured wine like nothing was wrong. The next day, I found her tagged in a photo, standing outside the real estate firm. New hire. I printed it, dated it, filed it under overlap. Then came the message I wasn't meant to see. It popped up on his iPad, left unlocked beside the sink. From her. Loved last night. You smelled like cinnamon again. It's starting to feel like home. That was the moment I knew I didn't live here anymore. I just paid the bills and baked the bread that left that scent on his shirt. But I still didn't confront him. Because I had more work to do. I wanted everything documented. I wanted patterns, not outbursts. I made appointments. I called a lawyer. I opened a P.O. box. I updated my resume, quietly, cautiously. Every step felt like erasing myself, then redrawing who I'd become. And when I found the second bank account, the one I hadn't known existed, I didn't cry. I bought a new folder. Read. Labeled it, Parallel Lives. One morning, I heard him in his office on the phone. "She's never going to push back," he said, laughing. "She's still clinging to that binder like it means anything." He wasn't talking about work. He was talking about me. I wrote the date and time on a sticky note, slid it into the back of the red folder. That weekend, I was, accidentally, left out of a dinner with his family. No invite, no explanation. Ava texted me later. "Grandma said you were probably too busy." I told them that didn't sound like you. That text made me cry. Not because of the exclusion, but because my daughter still saw me. Still recognized the weight I carried, even if no one else in that room did. When David came home late that night, I was awake. He looked surprised. "You're up." I nodded. He walked past me without another word. I sat at the dining table for hours after he went to bed. No wine. No tears. Just silence and a growing outline in my mind of how this would end, not with yelling, not with begging, but with evidence, and calm, and power. I was folding towels when I found out. It was just another Thursday afternoon. The hum of the dryer, the faint scent of lavender from the fabric softener, the quiet rhythm of a house too empty for its size. I was smoothing the corners of David's favorite gray bath towel when my phone pinged. I glanced down. An email forwarded by mistake. Subject line: closing confirmation, Tahoe unit, final docs attached. I stood still, towel in hand, the email loading slowly as if it, too, knew what was coming. David's name was on the document. He was listed as the buyer. The mailing address, though, wasn't ours. It was the firm's address. The one I used to manage. The one where I no longer had a desk or a name on the door. I scrolled further. The signature block, his signature. And someone else's. A woman. I didn't recognize the name. Not at first. But something in me already knew. That evening, I stood at the kitchen counter, pouring myself a glass of water I didn't drink. "Did you buy something out of state?" I asked. He didn't look up from his phone. "Work-related?" "Shouldn't we talk about big purchases?" "It's not big," he replied, still scrolling. "Then why not use our address?" He shrugged, then chuckled to himself. "Rachel, I've got it handled." Handled. Like I was an assistant. Like I was a burden to be managed. He didn't notice that I wasn't folding towels anymore. He didn't notice that I didn't join him for dinner. He didn't even notice I moved to the guest room that night. Ava's old room, the twin bed still had her lilac sheets. The glow, in the dark stars still clung to the ceiling. I lay there in silence, staring up, wondering how long I'd been disappearing before I noticed I was gone. The next day, I drove to the county clerk's office. No appointment. No makeup, no smile. The building smelled of old paper and cheap coffee. I waited under buzzing lights, my number flashing on a faded screen. The clerk slid the copy across the counter, and there it was, his name, and hers. I Googled her that night. The new hire. The woman from the firm's Instagram feed, the one who wore tailored pencil skirts and posted real estate tips about starting fresh. She looked young, sharp, and she had my husband's signature next to hers on 2 separate property deals. I didn't go home after that. I drove to Lena's. She didn't ask anything when she opened the door. Just handed me a mug of coffee. Black, chipped rim, still warm. I stood in her kitchen, staring at the steam. "I'm not surprised," I whispered. "But it still hurts." I nodded. She sat down beside me. "Even when you see the wreck coming, it still knocks the wind out of you." That night, back home, I logged into our joint email. I downloaded 5 years' worth of tax filings. Backed up client invoices, scanned PDF titles, 100 tiny breadcrumbs of where my labor had gone, and who had signed their name to it. I opened a new folder on my desktop. I called it Reclamation. His firm had 3 LLCs when I stepped back 2 years ago. It now had 7. Only 2 had my name on them. The rest, hidden under new entities, new managers. One name repeated. Hers. I clicked through document after document. The company I had helped build was being disassembled and rebuilt without me. It wasn't just betrayal. It was intentional erasure. I didn't eat the next day, not out of protest. I simply forgot. The idea of feeding myself felt like a luxury I hadn't earned. I sat at the dining table, sunlight casting long stripes across the hardwood floor. The place where Ava learned to read. The place where David and I used to laugh over takeout and wine. Now it was just a surface for my folders. That weekend, his mother called. "David said you've been acting distant." I stayed quiet. "Something going on," she pressed. "You've always been sensitive. I'm sure it's just a face." I gripped the edge of the counter. She wasn't cruel. Just complicit. "Rachel, don't ruin things by overreacting. You're lucky to have a man who provides. He's always been generous." Generous? He was giving someone else my legacy, piece by piece, and she called it generosity. That Sunday night, I sat in the driveway for nearly an hour. The porch light was on. His car was there. So was hers. I saw her silhouette in the upstairs window. Standing, moving, laughing. I couldn't breathe. Not because I didn't expect it, but because part of me still hoped I was wrong. On Monday morning, I printed the unsigned prenup. The one he had dismissed with a kiss years ago. "We're partners, Rachel," he'd said. "I'll never walk away from us." I filed it under a new tab, lies. Then came the moment that broke the last thread. I was walking past his home office when I heard her voice over speakerphone. "Hi." Sweet, sharp, edged. "She still thinks the company's half hers." He laughed. Not nervously. Not in defense. It was full. Easy. Comfortable. I stood in the hallway, frozen. He didn't know I was there. He wouldn't have cared if he did. That night, I packed 2 bags. One with copies of every document, one with clothes and my old laptop. I placed them in Ava's room closet, behind her college boxes. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I sat at her childhood desk and opened a fresh notebook. At the top, I wrote, Phase 1. Underneath it, copy of tax returns, property records, a voice memos organized, a passwords changed, and contact with attorney, a safety deposit box scheduled. Then I added one more line. Hey, erased me on paper. I'll write myself back in. I stopped pretending. That was the biggest shift. Not the discoveries, not the documents, but the quiet decision to stop performing the role they assigned me. I stopped making coffee for 2. Stopped asking if he'd be home for dinner. Stopped replying to Gloria's group texts about family brunches. No one seemed to notice. Or maybe they noticed. And liked it better that way. One morning, I walked into the kitchen and found David making a smoothie. He was humming. Something upbeat. He looked at me and said, "You should go for a walk today. Might help." I didn't answer. Not because I didn't have words, but because none of them were worth saying to someone who had already closed the door. He tapped the blender lid and added, "Oh, and I'll be gone this weekend. Conference in Chicago." I nodded. Even though I knew the event he mentioned didn't exist, I'd already called the hotel. There was no conference, no booking, just his name. And hers. That night, I cleaned out the filing cabinet in the guest room. Found old birthday cards from Ava, contracts from our first renovation project, a photo of David and me on the day he closed his first sale. I almost threw it out. But I paused. Because I remembered how proud he was. How proud we were. I had made the flyer. I had handled the paperwork. I had stayed up late reformatting the presentation he fumbled through twice before it landed. But in that photo, I was cropped at the edge, barely visible. Just fingertips on his shoulder. I put it in a new envelope labeled Proof I Existed. Lena called around midnight that Friday. She always knew when I couldn't sleep. "Are you okay?" "No," I whispered. "But I'm awake." Sometimes, that was enough. Saturday morning, Gloria left a voicemail. "I know you're upset, Rachel, but dragging this out only hurts everyone. You don't want Ava to see this bitterness. David's trying." I deleted it. There was a time her voice would have broken me. Now, it felt like background noise. I didn't reply to Ava's check in text, either. Not because I was angry, but because I didn't want to burden her with adult truths while she was still trying to be a girl in college, pretending things at home were fine. The worst part wasn't the betrayal. It was the smallness. The way it made me feel like a mistake. Like I was foolish for trusting. Foolish for staying too long. Foolish for believing that loyalty meant something. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I just got quieter. And sharper. I made a spreadsheet of every asset. Not just the obvious ones. Bank accounts, properties. But the emotional ones, too. Time spent managing contractors. Late nights doing books. Hosting client dinners at my own kitchen table. Wearing smiles at events where I wasn't introduced by name. Covering up when he forgot deadlines. Apologizing to people I didn't disappoint. There were no dollar signs next to those rows, but I highlighted them anyway. In yellow. the color of warning. One afternoon, I stood in the walk-in closet and stared at our rows of clothing, his suits, lined up, steam pressed. My blouses, faded from too many summers of sunlight through our bathroom window. There was a dress I hadn't worn in years. Deep burgundy, V-neck, soft fabric. He once told me I looked powerful in it. That was before he started saying I was too intense. I tried it on, it still fit. Even better, somehow, I left it out. By now, I had built a system. Every Tuesday legal file updates. Wednesdays, document scans. Fridays call with Lena. It gave me structure, and with structure came strength. I wasn't just surviving. I was preparing. I wrote something on the mirror with dry, erase marker. You are not what they remember. You are what you reclaim. Every time I brushed my teeth, I read it. Even when my eyes were tired, even when my hands shook. One night, I dreamed I was sitting at a dinner table full of people. But no one could hear me speak. I stood, screamed, pounded on the table. Still invisible. I woke up breathless and went straight to my desk. I wrote a list titled, What They Took. Then a second list. What I'm taking back. It wasn't revenge. It was arithmetic. On Sunday morning, I opened the cabinet where we kept the wedding album. It wasn't there. I looked again. Checked behind old recipe books, winter gloves, Ava's preschool art. Gone. I never moved it. Which meant he had. And I realized even the symbols meant to tether me to the past were being erased. Not just emotionally. Physically. Silently. I walked to the backyard with my mug of tea. The grass was too long. The fence needed staining. But the wind was soft. And the sky was clean. For a moment, I closed my eyes. I didn't think of him. Didn't think of her. Didn't even think of Ava. I just thought of air. And space. And the slow, deliberate act of breathing. There's something strange about walking into a lawyer's office with your entire life in a tote bag. The receptionist smiled politely. Offered water. Complimented my cardigan. She didn't know it was the same one I'd worn to Ava's parent-teacher conference in 7th grade. Back then, I had ironed it 3 times. Today, I didn't even check for lint. The conference room was smaller than I expected. Neutral walls. Soft lighting, 1 long table, 2 shiny. I sat on the left. James Morrison entered 5 minutes later, all steady shoes and quiet authority. He looked at my folders, then looked at me. Mrs. Monroe, he said, you came prepared. I nodded. I didn't smile. For the next hour, I laid it out. Timeline. Assets. Transfers. Ownership trails. He didn't interrupt much. Just scribbled notes, asked for dates, clarified names. When I mentioned the Tahoe property, he paused. Your name isn't on that deed? No. Was it purchased with joint funds? I nodded. Indirectly. From our business account, but routed through an LLC I wasn't told existed. His pen stopped moving. That's significant, he said softly. I showed him emails. Screenshots. The voicemail Gloria left. David's trying, she'd said. He's always been generous. James raised an eyebrow. This family has a pattern of centralizing power under one name. Yes, I said. And quietly pushing out anyone who helped them build it. He didn't reply right away. Instead, he opened a new file on his laptop. Do you want exposure? He asked. Or just leverage? I looked at my binder. My chipped nails. My reflection in the glass of the water pitcher. I want clarity, I said. I want to protect my legacy. I don't want to burn the house down. But I won't be erased. That night, I stopped by Ava's old room, opened the closet, and touched the strap of the bag I'd packed weeks ago. Everything was still there. Still folded, still waiting. I began organizing things digitally. Google Drive folders, scans backed up on encrypted USBs, a printed list of passwords stored at Lena's house. I labeled everything as if I were preparing for someone else to take over. But this time, I wasn't fading out. I was writing myself in. In the kitchen drawer, behind the batteries and old keys, I hid a flash drive labeled, Rachel, master copy. Not because I feared theft, but because I needed a ritual. A place that grounded me. That drawer had held Ava's crayon drawings, David's mortgage estimates, birthday invitations. Now it held my quiet rebellion. Lena came over on Friday. She brought Thai food and new printer ink. "I know you'll run out," she said, unloading bags. "And I don't want you at Staples with him in line behind you." We laughed. A little too hard, but it was the first time my shoulders had dropped in weeks. We sat on the porch while the takeout cooled. "Do you want revenge?" she asked. I shook my head. "No. I want to end it without begging. I want to walk away before they notice I'm gone, and realize too late that I took everything I was owed." That weekend, David invited friends over. I wasn't consulted. Wasn't introduced properly. I cleared plates, smiled politely, and caught snippets of conversation from the living room. "Rachel handles the books," he said once. "Used to anyway, she's more home-based now." Home-based. Like I was a printer. Like I hadn't spent years building the client pipeline he now took credit for. After everyone left, I asked him quietly, "Do you think I disappeared? Or are you hoping I'll forget I existed?" He didn't answer. Just looked at me like I'd spoken in another language. On Monday, James called. "We're ready," he said. "I'll have everything drawn up. You've got leverage. It's solid." I didn't speak. He waited. Then, gently, "Mrs. Munro, do you want mediation or full litigation?" I thought about Ava. About the Tahoe property. About the quiet way my name had been deleted from rooms I helped build. "Litigation," I said. "My story deserves more than silence." That evening, I found the wedding album, hidden under the stairs. A page had been torn out, the one from our 10th anniversary, my favorite. Paris trip, the toast, the dress. Gone. I ran my fingers along the ripped edge. Then closed the book. Some things weren't worth taping back together. I lit a candle that night. Not for him. For me. Lavender and cedarwood. It reminded me of Ava's room. Of clean sheets. Of nights I still believed in us. I poured myself a glass of red wine. Opened the sliding door. Let the air in. The house didn't feel like mine. But I was learning to breathe inside it again. Before bed, I wrote in my notebook. Justice doesn't have to be loud. Sometimes it's just not disappearing. Have you ever had to gather proof just to defend your place in a life you helped build? Share your story below. Or simply say, "May too." We see you. Subscribe to EN Reddit Story for more real stories of justice, healing, and quiet empowerment after 40. I remember the first time I sat across from David with nothing left to prove. It wasn't in a courtroom. Not even at the lawyer's office. It was at our own dining table. The same table where we used to host holiday dinners and birthday parties. Where Ava once spilled orange juice on a math worksheet and cried like it was the end of the world. Now, it was a war room. Stacks of folders to my right. A notepad in front of me. A pen in my hand, steady. David walked in, laptop under his arm, distracted. "Why need to talk?" I said. He froze. Not because of my tone, because I wasn't angry. And that scared him more. He sat. Slowly. "Rachel, if this is about last week, I really don't have the energy." "It's not about last week," I interrupted. "It's about the last 17 years. He glanced at my folders. "What is all this?" "Documentation," I replied. "I've been busy." For the next 15 minutes I outlined what I knew. The LLCs, the Tahoe property, the tax discrepancies, the ownership reassignments, the funding trails, the titles, The lies. He said nothing. He didn't deny a word. I pushed the final folder across the table. Inside, a summary James had prepared. Page 1, proposed settlement and disclosures. Page 2, intent to litigate if terms are rejected. He skimmed it. This is ridiculous. No, I said. This is generous. He stood. Didn't leave. Just paced. You've been planning this? Yes. While living under my roof. I looked up at him, steady. I earned every shingle. That night, he stayed in the guest room. The same room I had claimed for weeks. Now it was his turn to feel the space between walls and silence. The next morning, I called Gloria. I wasn't sure why. Maybe to warn her. Maybe to give her one last chance. I wanted you to hear it from me, I said. She sighed like I'd disappointed her. I just hoped you'd stay quiet. For Ava's sake. I didn't answer. Because I knew now. Quiet never protected anyone. It just made erasure easier. I met with James that week. We discussed deposition strategy, witnesses, financial tracing. I signed a document authorizing him to contact third-party appraisers. He slid another folder toward me. Inside, a list of people I'd worked with. Vendors, clients, contractors, each with invoices in my name. This will help prove your contribution, he said. I stared at the names. Some I hadn't spoken to in years. Some probably assumed I was just David's wife, the one who helped sometimes. But these invoices said otherwise. I was never just anything. I reached out to 2 of them. One replied within the hour. Of course I remember you, she wrote. You saved us during that inspection mess. Let me know how I can help. Small victories. But they stacked. Each one a brick. Each one a reminder I built this house, too. Later that week, I returned to the county office. I filed for a freeze on 2 jointly held properties pending court determination. The clerk didn't blink. She just stamped the paperwork and said, "Good luck." I nodded. Not luck. Documentation? Lena and I met for lunch that Friday. I brought my binder. She brought champagne. Too early, she teased. No, I said, smiling for the first time in weeks. It's right on time. We sat by the window at our favorite cafe. Sunlight hit the silverware. The air smelled like rosemary and warm bread. I told her everything. The court dates. The appraisals. The tone David used when he realized I wasn't bluffing. She listened like she always did, without flinching. You know, she said, you didn't just plan a response. You rewrote the ending. That night, I took a walk around the block. The same neighborhood I used to jog with Ava when she was 7. The cracked sidewalk near the church. The magnolia tree that blooms early. It all looked the same. But I was different. When I came home, I found a note on the kitchen counter. We don't have to do this in court. Let's be civil. No apology. No ownership. Just fear. The kind that shows up when someone realizes the person they underestimated. Kept the receipts. I folded the note. Slipped it into my file, labeled it, "When they blink first." By Sunday, I had my script. 3 sentences. Clear, unshakable. I am not angry. I am not afraid. I am not backing down. That evening, I reheated leftover soup, lit a candle, and sat at the table with my folders spread before me. This was my paperwork. My armor. My power. No one would call me a gold digger again. Because I could show, page by page, where the gold came from, and whose hands built the mine. The courthouse smelled like paper and polished wood. Cool air. Muted voices. 100 tiny reminders that this was a place where stories got rewritten in legal language. I wore the burgundy dress. The one he once said made me look powerful. I didn't wear it for him. I wore it to remind myself that power doesn't have to shout. David walked in 10 minutes late. His tie was crooked. He didn't look at me. But his lawyer, Thompson, I think, did. The same one who'd once chuckled in mediation called me non-contributory. Now he barely met my eye. Maybe he'd seen the binder, or maybe he'd finally read the documents James had sent. James sat beside me calm. He didn't smile much. But he nodded once when the judge entered. That was enough. The hearing was procedural. Just property motions, timeline reviews, initial asset declarations. No one cried, no one shouted. But with every form submitted, every record acknowledged, the temperature in the room shifted. David's confidence drained quietly, like a faucet left barely open. Steady, inescapable. The judge turned to David's side. Why was Mrs. Monroe's name removed from 4 corporate accounts in the same quarter she was asked to step back from day operations? His lawyer answered with vague words. Restructuring, strategy, efficiency. James didn't interrupt. He simply slid forward a page marked Email Exhibit 2A. David's own words. In black and white. Let's move everything into my name while she's distracted. I watched the judge's eyes narrow. Her pen froze on the page, then moved again. Slowly. Later, in the hallway, David caught up to me. He looked older than I remembered. Worn down. Deflated. He started with, Rachel, can we just not drag this out? I looked at him. Not with anger. Not even sadness. Just clarity. You already did, I said. I'm just finishing what you started. Back in the conference room, James outlined the terms. I would retain a 45% stake in the firm, 2 properties reassigned to me in full, restitution on joint funds used to purchase Tahoe, and a non-disparagement clause. For both of us. She's not looking to ruin you, James said simply. She's protecting herself. That's all. David's lawyer asked for a moment. They stepped outside. James and I sat in silence. I looked down at my notes. 3 pages. Every number double-checked. Every date verified. And 1 line circled at the top. Do not let them make this personal. It was always business to them. They returned 10 minutes later. David didn't speak. But his lawyer nodded. We'll sign. Afterwards, James handed me a single sheet to initial. His pen was smooth. The ink didn't blot. When it was done, he said, You did well. I nodded. But I didn't smile. Not yet. In the parking lot, the air smelled like concrete and spring rain. I sat in my car, binder beside me, engine off. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was bracing for impact. I just sat. Breathing. Whole. 3 days later, the Tahoe property was transferred. Title updated. My name restored. I received the confirmation email at 10:70 a.m. I made coffee, sat on the porch, and watched a squirrel steal pieces of mulch from the flower bed. Funny what you notice when your body isn't full of tension. That week, Gloria called. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail. I hope you're happy. You broke something that didn't need to be broken. I didn't respond. Because what broke was already cracked before I said a word. Ava came home that weekend. She hugged me longer than usual. Said nothing. But that night, I found a note on my pillow. Mom, I've always known who did the real work around here. Thank you for teaching me what quiet strength looks like. I cried. Not because I lost, but because I had finally, truly won. 6 months later, the house felt different. Not because the walls had changed, not because the furniture had moved, but because I was finally breathing in a space I hadn't been allowed to own. Not truly. For years. There was a softness to my mornings now. I brewed coffee in silence, the scent of hazelnut filling the kitchen. I played records while folding laundry. I took slow walks, not to escape, but to exist. The settlement closed 3 weeks after court. The money helped. But it wasn't the check that mattered. It was the memo line transfer of share. Per contribution. That one sentence told the truth. On paper, in numbers. In language they couldn't twist. I used part of it to rebuild my resume. Not figuratively. Literally. I created a website, updated LinkedIn, filed a DBA under my maiden name. Monroe had been a life I lived. But it wasn't where I ended. I didn't start a company. I didn't publish a book. I didn't reinvent myself. I just returned to the woman I was before she started doubting herself. And that was enough. Some nights I still dream of the courtroom, of folders, of judges, of David's silence. But then I wake to a home filled with music, rosemary on the porch, and a calendar that belongs only to me. Ava came home again in April. She brought laundry, stories, and a quiet knowing in her eyes. We made lemon pasta together, just like old times. She sat on the counter, still in her hoodie, watching me stir. "You seem lighter," she said. I smiled. Turns out truth has weight. But so does letting go. Later, we drank tea on the porch. She asked if I ever regretted anything. I thought about it. "I regret not saving copies sooner," I said. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I forgot to trust myself. Lena still calls. Sometimes we don't talk about anything at all. Just hold space for each other. We've learned that not every wound needs an audience. But every strength deserves a witness. The burgundy dress still hangs in my closet. I haven't worn it since court. But I keep it there. Not as a memory of what I endured, but as proof of what I faced down with my chin high and my hands steady. I never answered Gloria's last message, but I didn't delete it either. Some bridges don't need burning. They just don't need crossing again. Last week, a former client emailed me. She'd heard what happened. Said she was going through something similar. I wrote back simply keep everything. Organize. Don't apologize for knowing your worth. She replied with a heart. And I knew. This wasn't just my story anymore. Justice doesn't always look like headlines. Sometimes it's a PDF file, a voice memo, a signature in the right place. Sometimes, justice is the quiet knowledge you stayed kind, but not silent. And legacy? It's not the house, or the firm, or even the money. It's the look in your daughter's eyes when she sees you stand up straight again. When she says, "You didn't just survive, you taught me how to rise." If you've ever rebuilt your life after being quietly erased, share your story below. You are not alone, and your worth is not up for debate. Subscribe to EN Reddit Story for more true stories of closure, justice, and quiet empowerment after 40.